everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What the Forensics. My name is Rebecca, and I am joined here again today by the wonderful Journey and Nicole. This week, Nicole will be educating us on what happens to bones when they get burnt, and also telling us about Anthony Kirkland, who burnt his victims. Journey is then going to be giving us an update on a pretty well-known case that we haven't covered yet, but it's still relevant to our previous topics we've covered. Before we get started, I would like to note that there is a listener's discretion advised, as there are brief descriptions of sexual assault. And just before we get started, I'm sorry if you hear my cat yelling at me. It's supper time. With that being said, let's get into this exciting episode.
Hi, Ophi, just by the way. So I'll get started with Anthony Kirkland. He was born on September 13th, 1968, and unfortunately there's not a lot of information that is out in the world about his upbringing, about his childhood. I think he was born in Cincinnati, but I'm not 100% sure on that, and there's not a lot of information on what his family life was like, but apparently his lawyers do argue that he was physically and mentally abused as a child. It wasn't until he came under police spotlight at the age of 18 on May 29th, 1987, when he murdered his girlfriend, Leola Douglas, when she refused to have sex with him. According to some sources, he had sexually assaulted her, poured lighter fluid over her, then set her on fire while she was still alive.
Wow.
And this, unfortunately, was confirmed, at least the last end of that was confirmed through the autopsy report, which did indicate that she was unfortunately alive at the time of burning.
That's terrible.
Yeah. So I really hope she was not conscious and didn't experience any of it. But yes, so she unfortunately passed away in this horrific manner. And her body was found on literally the front steps of his house. So it didn't take him long to become suspect number one, and not a very great spot to burn your victim, I will say.
No, like if you don't want to get caught for the crime, maybe don't leave evidence of it like on your front steps, maybe.
Very staggering evidence too. You can't really hide a burnt body.
Well, you can't be like, that was there by accident. I didn't do that. Someone's framing me.
Had a bonfire on my front yard or my front porch. Don't know how that
she's only my ex-girlfriend. Like what?
Oh my!
It was just spontaneous combustion. It's so common.
Exactly. She just came over and saw me, and I'm so hot, and she just burst into flames. Like,
oh my god,
ridiculous.
Case closed. End of story.
Yep.
But after this incident, Anthony Kirkland did plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter, so he pled to the lesser charge that he faced, and he was sentenced to 16 years in prison, which he served in full, and was later released in 2003. His parole period ended in 2004, though, meaning that he somehow only served 1 year of parole. I don't know if this is standard. I don't know other cases that I could name that this happened.
Yeah. Well, that was a question I had too, because it's like, that feels like a very short parole time, I guess, for someone who did kill someone. And I also don't understand why, like, I'm assuming that he could just got a deal for less time for voluntary manslaughter if he pled guilty.
Mm-hmm.
But he had the option to go to trial for like first or second degree murder.
From my understanding, yeah. And he could have faced more years than 16, but...
Yeah, I guess I just didn't really understand like the difference between voluntary manslaughter and a degree of murder in this. So I was like, I don't know.
When it comes to murder, I think like first is premeditation. Second degree, isn't second degree manslaughter, or is manslaughter like an accident basically?
Manslaughter is an accident, but second degree is when you don't mean to kill someone.
So, okay.
So I don't know the difference between the two. I think manslaughter would be like if you hit someone with a car. You didn't mean
you like
to kill
making
them.
a right turn, someone's walking by, you nail them.
Yeah, but maybe if you like accidentally give someone food poisoning.
Maybe
like,
second degree then would be if you're in a car, you see someone you don't like, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I really don't like this person, drive them over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I looked it up, and you're basically right. It's when it says when someone's acting recklessly and they're aware of their potentially fatal actions. So
Yeah.
it's an accident. Still bad, but
How do you...
You'd have to prove intention.
Yeah, but like burning a human, that doesn't seem like an accident to me.
No, and the lighter fluid is fairly deliberate.
Seems pretty, maybe not premeditated, but yes, very deliberate in the sense of you have an intention of burning this person.
You are intending to kill this person.
Yeah.
So then is third degree murder, because that's a thing, right?
I think third degree is manslaughter, is it not? This is a whole other side
I know that
tangent.
manslaughter is somehow different, but I've never been aware of what the difference is between the four of those things.
I'll tell you, I heard it in class once, and I didn't.
Okay, I'm gonna Google this. What's third degree murders?
Move.
This is unintentionally causing someone to die while doing something dangerous.
Oh,
no, you're right. Manslaughter is also known as third degree murder.
okay.
Okay, interesting. Because it does not contain malice.
Oh, okay.
Interesting.
Okay, yeah. So he back to the story.
Yeah, that was quite a tangent.
It got a little bit of a tangent. That's okay. So yeah, he served a year of parole. We don't really know why, but he did. While he was in prison, he received his GED and associate's degree. He was also placed in solitary confinement numerous times, about 21, if we want a number. And this was between 1998 and 2003 for disciplinary control. And within his last 9 months in prison, he was sent to solitary 4 times for breaking the rules and or fighting other inmates. Sounds like a fun guy. And initially, he was denied parole because of his crime, but there was a ruling by the Ohio Supreme Court that said, quote, parole-eligible inmates had to be judged by their conviction and not just the crime, end quote. So this is why he was ultimately released after his 16 years. He got his 1 year of parole, and I don't know though. I guess his conviction was manslaughter and not burning a human alive, but yeah. I can understand. I can get the difference there.
Yeah.
And I do want to preface before I get into victims and dates and ages, there was a bit of discrepancies among sources. So a few of the dates and ages of the victims vary. I'll give kind of both, but just know nothing's really set in stone with that. But on that note, in January of 2005, Kirkland was accused of sexually assaulting a neighbor at knife point, but then was later acquitted of the charges. So really good start after being released. And then in May of 2006, he had killed Cassania Crawford, who was 14 or 15 at the time. She had just left her grandmother's house when she had ran into Kirkland. They struck up a conversation, and he offered her $20 to have sex with him. She said no. Yeah, she said no, as I think many 14, 15-year-olds or anyone really would. Mm-hmm. So he offered her $60, to which she refused again. I would too. I don't know about you guys.
Because he's 36 at this time.
Yeah. And she's 14 or 15.
Yeah.
At her second refusal, Kirkland flew into a fit of rage and then choked her until she went limp and then ultimately burned her body as well. And you'll come to learn, as this episode describes, we will be talking about burnt remains. So that was kind of his signature, I guess, was trying to hide evidence through burning their bones. But her remains were found on May 11th of 2006 in Avondale, and this is a neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio. And the reason I think he's from Cincinnati is because of the area in which these crimes took place. And then a couple of the sources I found through like the Ohio court systems said a Cincinnati gentleman. So I would assume he's from Cincinnati. But there's no like explicit thing that says he was born here in Cincinnati. Is that even a word now? Cincinnati?
Yeah.
But we're going to say that he's from that place.
Also, I did my math wrong. He's 38 now, not 36.
38. That's okay. Give or take a couple years. On June 14th, 2006, he had run into Mary Jo Newton, who was 45 at the time, and they had struck up a conversation, and this ultimately led to her getting into his van. I don't know what type of van he had, probably one of those creepy no-window vans. One would just assume. They had gone to a park called Eden Park, and he started to get violent with her. She tried to leave the van, but he had chased her and brought her back in, where he then choked her. On June 16th, 2006, police found the burned remains of Mary Jo Newton behind a vacant building in Avondale. So I don't know the exact circumstances, but I would assume that he had strangled her to death. There was a common theme seen throughout the victim, where he strangled them and or stabbed them and then burnt them. Yeah. And I don't know if all of these victims were still alive when they died, like the first girlfriend, or if they had already passed before being set on fire. Yeah. I would hope the latter.
Me too.
Some sources say that Newton was killed around April or May of 2006, though. But either way, it was within the first half of 2006 that she was killed. In December of 2006, though, on December 22nd, 25-year-old Kimya Rawlinson was killed. He again struck up a conversation with her. She, like Mary Jo Newton, agreed to get into his van, and he had told her, or he told like police during an interview, that he had just recently been robbed. So he was like super angry before and during picking her up, which led to his aggressions towards her, or contributed to her aggressions. When she was in the van, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her in the neck. He took her body into the woods and then later burned it. And her body wasn't found for months until a dog had actually found her femur, and she was then later identified from this discovery.
Him stabbing her in the neck reminds me of when we went to court and we heard that guy give his testimony about how he was hired to just poke her in the neck, and that meant like stab her.
Really?
Do you remember that?
I don't remember that at all. I remember physically sitting in court, but I don't remember like any conversation or any testimony that happened.
It was a core memory for me.
Wow.
So scary, because he was just like so nonchalantly. It was just like, like he just like, and then I just had to like poke her and like
with a knife,
stab her.
Yeah. To take her life. Okay.
I was like, oh my God, you've seen my face. I'm here. I've seen your face. Am I next? And I just panicked. So when I heard that he did this kind of the same thing, I was like, oh my gosh, it's scary.
Just a little poke. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I forgot we did that. I should go sit in on court again. That was fun. Mm-hmm. Not fun because you know what I mean. You know the level of fun that we're talking about. There's levels.
Yep.
But yeah, so on May 14th, 2007 now, Anthony Kirkland threatens to kill his 18-month-old son. He was in a SWAT standoff with them. I'm not quite sure what led to the standoff.
Yeah.
But there was a standoff. SWAT got involved. He threatened to kill him, the son, and then he was convicted 3 months later of 2 counts of unlawful restraint and was sentenced to 115 days in jail.
It just seems so like swept under the rug. It was like, he was just in a SWAT standoff, but they don't mention anything more about it.
Yeah, like I'm wondering, did the police know at this point, like during the SWAT standoff, that he had murdered these other women, or is this just kind of happening in the background? Like this is a whole other thing.
This is just a whole other thing. Like they know. I mean, if they did the research, hopefully they would know that he had been to jail for that previous murder already. But the 2 murders that just happened, I feel like they haven't connected any of it yet.
Wow. Oh,
and then the standoff. Yeah,
he is way too involved with the police.
Way too involved. Like, just hide a little bit, buddy. Like, why are you causing this commotion?
Like that's just insane. Just wrong place, wrong time, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, he served his 115 days. Shortly after his release, Reverend Walter Bledsoe, he got a restraining order against Kirkland on behalf of his family, of the Bledsoe family. And no one knows why. And even court records don't say why he applied for the order. It was just that they got this restraining order. It was granted by a judge. And then December 2007 is when it kind of started.
Wild that court won't even be like, it was for XYZ.
Maybe the only thing I could think of is like a publication ban, maybe something having to do with the child. I don't know if they had children, but that would be the only thing that would make sense in my brain.
And yeah, unless they like adopted his son or something, I don't know. Like it's just so odd.
Oh, yeah. So many options. If anyone knows why, let us know. I'm curious.
Yeah.
But yes, on September 26th now of 2007, this guy's so grimy. He attempted to solicit sex from his girlfriend's 13-year-old daughter.
Gross.
And then he was convicted in March of 2008 for importuning, I believe it's pronounced. And this is basically the persistent harassment of someone for or to do something. So he was charged with harassment, essentially, and not soliciting sex from a 13-year-old. But
yeah, no doubt.
Tomato. He was sentenced in 1 year in prison for this and then had to register as a sex offender. And then alongside this, he had to register his address with the sheriff's office. This may not seem like a really important piece, but it comes back into play later on. Jump forward about a year and a month. On October 20th of 2008, he was released from prison, entered a halfway house called the Pog Rehabilitation Center.
I just said Pog. I guess it could be Pogue, but I just said Pog.
We'll say Pog. Pogue. And then about a couple months later, half a year later, February 27th of 2009, Kirkland got into a fight with another resident at this halfway house. This resulted in him being thrown out of the residence because of their no-fight policy that they had. And during this altercation, police had been called, but the other resident actually refused to press charges. So Kirkland didn't end up being arrested for this. The halfway house, though, didn't notify his parole officer about this change of address or about the altercation that happened until 2 days later. And I guess because it was the weekend, and they don't inform them on the weekend. Gotta get the
I feel
time
like
off.
You have like a high profile, or high risk offender as your parolee. You might want to be open to working weekends.
Yeah, just maybe.
Bare minimum.
Yeah, crime is not like a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 kind of gig.
Literally, it does happen outside of business hours.
Yeah. Just put your phone on, put your phone on the ringer. Just answer it once in a while.
It's so aggravating.
But yeah, so they waited 2 days. And then Kirkland also didn't immediately register with his parole officer that he was no longer at the halfway house. With the sheriff to let them know that he had changed addresses. And so he was just kind of roaming the streets at this point. So then on March 1st, 2009, Kirkland is then accused of breaking into a house, hiding in a bathroom, and then stabbing a gentleman named Frederick Hughes with scissors. I don't know their connection, don't know why, or if he was just seeking a thrill. Hughes actually survives at least 10 stab wounds, but Kirkland does manage to flee the scene, and a warrant is issued for his arrest on charges of aggravated burglary and felonious assault. So just assault. Seems like a name, felonious.
It's kind of fancy.
A little bit fancy, yeah.
Instead of just regular assault, it's felonious assault.
Felonious. I originally thought it was felonious too. That's how I would initially have pronounced it, but it seems much more sophisticated.
Yeah, very much so.
Felonious. Watch us not be pronouncing that right at all too.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, the next day, March 2nd, 2009, his parole officer is finally notified that he was kicked out of the halfway house. And so he begins looking for Kirkland. 2 days later, March 4th, a second arrest warrant was issued because of him failing to register his address after being kicked out of this house. So it was kind of a snowball effect with this. On March 5th, the next day, he was accused of threatening a Roberta Baldwin, which is his child's mother, his older than 18 months old son now, but his child's mother, with a knife. He flees. Another arrest warrant, is issued, and this one for domestic violence, aggravated menacing, and violation of a protection order.
Something it is so scary to me. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say they've got fancy charges in Ohio.
Yeah.
They do. Like aggravated menacing. Yeah. I know that actually is like a bad thing, but every time I think of something being menacing, I just think of like a cartoon villain.
Yeah, exactly.
I know it still happens like a lot. Like people with arrest warrants go missing because they're on the run because they know they're wanted. But I just think it's really scary that like he was on parole and like shouldn't you have more eyes on you? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like I know he's on parole and he's a high risk parolee. So why doesn't he have an ankle bracelet or something like that? Oh, yeah, there's just so much wrong.
Yep. On March 7th or 8th of 2009, 13-year-old Esme Kenny went for a jog near her house in Winton Hills. And about a half hour later, her parents called the police since she hadn't returned home yet. And it was a bit of out of character for her to be this late returning home. So the police began a search for her. According to Kirkland, I assume upon his arrest and interrogation, Esme had bumped into him while jogging. She tried to apologize, but then this led to him becoming irrationally angry, and so he started physically assaulting her. He then proceeded to sexually assault her, strangle her, and then attempted to set her remains on fire. At 11:30 p.m. that evening, police found Kirkland sleeping against a tree in the woods near her house. And some of her artifacts or belongings were found in his pocket. So they'd actually found a watch and an iPod belonging to Esme in his pocket. And on March 9th, the police then find Esme's body in the woods, only about 100 yards from where they found Kirkland sleeping against the tree.
Wow.
So
they didn't look very hard.
No, that's my first thought too. Because she was strangled and then the lower part of her body had been burned to try and get rid of the sexual assault evidence. But I feel like a half-burnt child or teen would be noticeable. Unless it's like heavy growth forests that maybe they didn't notice anything, but...
I feel like you'd smell it too.
Yeah.
Because like, it didn't happen that long ago.
No.
Because, they found her they found her early in the morning. Like 2:30.
Yeah, it was at like 3 a.m. or something like that.
Yeah. So she'd only maybe just stopped burning.
Yeah. Because they had found him at 11:30 p.m. So not even 5 hours. And they found her body. So I think they just need to invest in better police officers. But that's besides the point. So yes, police arrest Kirkland and charge him with her murder. He apparently admitted to murdering Esme as well as Cassania. And through their investigation, Kirkland was also connected to the murders of Mary Jo and Kimya. And his bond was held for over $5 million, which is quite a lot of money, I will say.
They finally decided, like, hey, we don't want him on the streets.
Yeah. Maybe he should not be allowed back on the streets.
Right?
So Kirkland entered a guilty plea to all charges when he went to trial, and the jury found him guilty on the 4 counts of murder in addition to the abuse of a corpse in March of 2010. Kirkland was sentenced to death for the murders of Esme and Cassania, the 2 teenagers. Yes, the 2 teenagers?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Kirkland was the youngest of the 4. But he was also charged or sentenced with 70 years to life for the murders of Kimya and Mary Jo. Kirkland's legal team had filed for a number of appeals, and in May of 2014, his conviction and death sentence was upheld. But in October of 2014, the Supreme Court of Ohio did grant a motion for a stay of execution. Later on, 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal. But as of May 2016, the Supreme Court of Ohio granted a motion for a new sentencing hearing, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then in August of 2020, though, the Ohio Supreme Court affirmed the death sentence imposed. So basically they said, F you, you're sticking with the death sentence because of the murders of the two teens. And then the Supreme Court of Ohio, there was a majority rejection of, like, Anthony or Kirkland was very adamant on getting across that he was improperly sentenced to death, that he should have been sentenced to life in prison, and that was just a wrongdoing by being sentenced to death. But a majority in the Supreme Court said, no, you are wrong on that. So
yeah.
It's quite the roller coaster of like appeals and life sentence. Actually, never mind. Death sentence. Actually, no, never mind. Life. Yeah. You know what? Like that is way too complicated.
Yeah. Well, and like literally life in prison is literally just a death sentence. They just don't kill you because you're on death row for much longer than you'd expect.
Yeah, it's because
he's
crazy.
Still there.
Yeah, he's still hanging out there.
He's been in prison for 13 years, like.
But anyways, that is Anthony Kirkland.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for telling us about Anthony Kirkland. And I know you're really excited to talk about this because you did a whole project on this in university.
I did.
So would you now also care to lead our discussion on burnt bones?
Yeah, I would love to. I have a very strange fascination with burnt bones, I will say, and in a scientific manner. And I'm also apologizing to our listeners because this is a whole long episode of just me talking. So hopefully you love my voice because we've got more to cover. But I kind of went broad to then talk about the effects of fire on bone, just to kind of help you visualize it, I guess, before I start. But when you're looking at kind of the wide range of cases that anthropologists can undertake or any sort of forensic investigative person to undertake, the presence of burnt bones isn't really that uncommon, as burning, as we could see with Anthony Kirkland. It's said to be a favored manner of disposing victims' bodies because perpetrators often like to believe that it's like the number one way of destroying evidence. And we see it a lot in media as well, where the victims will be burned in an attempt to impair identification or to destroy evidence, any of that. And like, while yes, it does destroy physical evidence, there's a lot more that kind of goes into it. And with this being said, fire is arguably one of the most destructive factors when looking at like a forensic lens or looking through a forensic lens because of the damage and the erasure that it can cause to evidence. And depending on how burnt skeletal remains are, this will ultimately affect how easily they are to examine, which makes sense. The more burnt you have, the harder it is to identify.
Yeah.
And charred remains aren't really a huge issue for experts, since serology and visual identification can still be completed most of the time. And so like charred is kind of the initial level of burning, like not really burnt. You still have the bone. It's just was kind of in the fire for a little bit. It's when investigators are left with incomplete cremated remains. And so these are remains that are pretty well turned to ash. So think of like a crematorium, like you are cremating your remains, you are incinerating them. These are the most difficult to work with, and this is because the duration and the heat levels can cause discoloration, they can cause shrinking, warping, cracking, splitting, and a whole bunch of other different distortions.
Well, especially when you think of like a body actually being cremated, like there's just ash left over. And so if you do have a body that has been cremated and you're trying to identify it, like you have to identify it from these little tiny shards of bone, which I can imagine how difficult that is.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Because the thing with cremation too is it doesn't, like, you don't get all of the bone turned into ash. So they'll actually like pulverize the bone. Like if you send a loved one to be cremated, they like blender
That's a terrifying thought. I hated that.
the bones.
Okay.
Well, you don't want, like, you getting chunks of your
Well, yeah, you don't want to be
like
like, when you're spreading their ashes, have it be chunky, right? Like,
you get like their piece of their mandible.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I just didn't appreciate the visual of pulverizing a loved one.
Do you like my NutriBullet effect too? Hand motion.
Oh, I didn't know that's what you were doing. Gross.
Yeah, just a little NutriBullet action. Not an ad. NutriBullet, though, if you do want to sponsor us.
Sponsored. And they probably never will now.
Appease to different audiences, okay? But yeah, cremated remains harder to identify. This means that effects of heat and fire on bone, as you can guess, can obscure estimations of sex, age, stature, race, and pretty well any other variable you can think of, making them difficult to determine. And so burnt remains also pose the difficulty of identifying trauma that happened before death, which is also known as perimortem trauma, as this trauma can be masked by the burning process. And so a study that was conducted in 2021 had actually looked at the detection of like dismemberment related tool marks in cremated cadavers. So basically they just had a whole bunch of cadavers, sawed at them a little bit, did their thing with all of these sharp force traumas or sharp force instruments, and then they burnt them. So they had inflicted 55 sharp force trauma injuries to embalmed cadavers. They then burnt them and then examined the bones after. And the researchers of the study found only 7 tool marks were able to be identified after burning out of the 55.
Holy cow.
Right?
Briefly, aside from like just how little tools could be identified, because that's crazy. Can you imagine how weird that job must be?
Yeah,
like being a researcher at a cadaver farm. And I don't know. It's just like that's one of the most like gruesome jobs I think exist.
Well, it reminds me, speaking of sharp force trauma, what the program or the study that Dr. Tice just did with the blood spatter analyst. I saw pictures on their Instagram of them just like wail it away with an axe to these bones.
Yeah, it looks so cool because I think they had frozen them, right?
Yeah.
Or they looked frozen. Yeah. So next week we talked to a forensic anthropologist, who we're talking about now. And if you check on her Instagram, she has pictures that she did with a blood spatter analysis as well.
Yeah. At Suncoast Forensics.
So cool.
It looked like I would love to do a science project like that.
Ooh, same.
Right? Anyways, so yeah, that was a little study just to kind of show that fire is powerful. And there are 3 general phases that bones will go through when exposed to heat. And it's important to note, though, that these phases aren't independent of each other or discrete. So each bone could be going through different phases at different times, depending on the factors at play. So the first phase, this is when temperatures reach about 100 to 500 degrees Celsius. This is when the bone begins to lose water. And as fluid is lost, shrinkage in both the length and width of the bone occurs. And as temperatures then rise and hit about 500 to 600 degrees, the bone begins to lose collagen. And so this is the bone's primary organic material. And this, in addition to the loss of water, will reduce its overall weight. And during these first 2 phases, there's also an increase in bone porosity, and this makes the bone more fragile and susceptible to fracturing, fragmentation, and breaking. And another research actually has shown that when the bone dehydrates and loses its collagen, its plasticity and then its plastic reaction decreases. So this means that as more stress is placed onto the bone, it's going to become more brittle, which like you can kind of make sense with that with the fire. I always think of like if you burn a piece of wood, the longer it's in the fire and the drier it gets, it just kind of crumbles beneath you.
Yeah.
So kind of the same concept with bone. But essentially during phase 1 and 2, the bone's resistance to this elastic deformation decreases in addition to a decrease in the bone's strength. So it's just not, I mean, fire's not going to be great for bone, but this is like where it starts to not be great. And so the density, structural integrity, and stress and strain relationship is ultimately changed. So this just causes a greater likelihood of fracturing with the bone. In the last phase, generally between 700 to 1200 degrees Celsius is when components within the bone begin to disappear. So this is like magnesium, that kind of stuff. There's also, when you look in the bone and like the histological components and just the structure of it, there's like a crystal lattice work that is present in bone. And so these crystal lattice work structures actually begin to melt and like fuse together, which is pretty cool.
Holy cow.
It reorganizes the overall mineral structure of the bone, which I thought was really fascinating.
That's so cool.
That is so cool. Just for like more visualizing, when you say crystal structure, that's the part of the inside of the bone. It almost looks like really, really tiny, like honeycombs or like sponge, right?
Yeah.
Or is this like on a microscopic level?
It's on a microscopic level. So I kind of talk about it too, but like when you look at a bone, you've got the cortical bone, which is the outside hard bone. And then that spongy bone in the middle is like the trabecular bone. So that's the honeycomb-like spongy type bone. Yeah. And then within the bone though, so kind of on a more microscopic level, that's where you get that crystal structure.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome. But yeah, so this reorganization of the crystal structure leads to further shrinkage and reduced porosity. And then this ultimately affects the bone's potential to pressure. So here at this stage 2, once you reach this higher temperature, the bone can actually change into a more like ceramic, fine china-like structure. And so this is called calcined bone. And so this type of bone, which is considered the most burnt type of bone, has shown to be more fragile than unburnt and charred bone since a great deal of collagen and water has been lost, basically. And I don't know, like, it's basically white bone. Like when you think of burning a bone or burning wood, we'll talk about wood. If you burn wood, it goes through the phases of like getting really dark, turning into like coal. And then after it's been burning for a while, it kind of is like gray and white. I don't know if you guys can
like the color of ash.
Yeah. So you'll see that in the bone, but the bone is still whole. So I assume though, if you were to like touch it, it could crumble because it's very, very brittle. But you have that like chalky fine china like bone structure.
Well, that is so fascinating.
Yeah, even bones just as a whole, like they're not as white as they are on TV. Because I know when people like think of like the TV show Bones, they're like, oh, a skeleton is like perfectly white. That's actually not true.
It's like bleached bone at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. They usually find that with sun bleach, but then they're also super brittle. So yeah.
Yeah. And I'll talk about color transformation a little bit too. Just keep that in mind. But each of these phases can vary depending on a whole bunch of other factors, which you'll kind of come to realize with burning bones is a lot can happen and a lot of factors affect other factors. So this makes examining them all that much more difficult because you have to consider all of these things. Like for example, in circumstances where advanced decomp has occurred to a body before being burned, this absence of a periosteum, it's called. This is the membrane of blood vessels and nerves that wraps around the majority of your bone. In the absence of this membrane, this can allow for tissue to burn away with a lot less resistance, resulting in an accelerated burning of that area. So say like you had advanced decomp in certain areas of your body, that would burn faster than other areas.
Right.
So even just like physical differences can cause different accelerated burning patterns. Any perimortem trauma that's caused any sort of like open wound, this can affect how bones are burnt. Accelerated exposure will be present, and this results in the burning of organic components to happen faster. And because of this, color changes can be seen in the bones. So you'll see a bit of a color change in those open wound regions, and they'll be slightly different from areas that weren't affected as well. So that can kind of help you determine if something happened before death, during death, and I guess how the fire affected different things. I don't know. Fire is so, what's the word? Like
unpredictable?
Unpredictable. Yeah. Yeah. Unpredictable. And it just fucks everything up.
Well, especially because like if you're burning over like an open wood fire, right? Like you can't keep the same heat.
Yeah.
But if you're in like a crematorium, there's ways to control how hot it is, like where the body's being burnt. So even that can affect what happens.
Exactly. Another thing that I thought was kind of interesting is that another issue that can impact how bones react to heat is how decomposed, I guess it is. But the study in the article that I read described the body as being fleshed, defleshed but green, or defleshed and dry.
I love defleshed but green.
Do you want to take a guess at what that means?
Like, is it green in color?
No. Think of like a green tree. Like, you know, when it's like a young tree?
Still a little wet.
Yeah. So it means
that's a great
like,
way to describe that, Kay.
Yeah. Do they have all of their skin? Are they decomposed in a way that there's no skin, but they still got some wet bone? Or are they decomposed completely and their skeleton is dry?
Just skeleton. Yeah.
And then body fat is another thing that can affect how your body burns. How close you are to the heat source can affect how your body burns. So some bones will burn at higher intensities if fat is present, since it acts as a fuel source. Also, the closer you are to a heat source, kind of the hotter it's going to be, the greater effects that you'll see on the bone. And another interesting thing that I read was that the more distal bones of your hands and feet, so these are like the furthest bones from your midline core, they won't be burned with such a high intensity compared to those near the center of your body where more fat is located. So since
that's
there's
very
less
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of reminds me, it's really slightly off topic, but I was reading something about human spontaneous combustion, which I also mentioned earlier. I don't know why it's just on my mind. But I was reading one of the theories for why it happens is often in people who are a little bit overweight, so have more fat on them, and who might have been either alcoholic in their life or like really heavily drinking. So it's kind of the thought. And again, this is just like a random theory. I don't even know where I read it. Human combustion is still like no one knows. But it's basically just a theory that like someone is so like their blood is so full of alcohol, like they get too close to a flame or something, whatever. And then like, because usually with spontaneous combustion victims, it's like the torso area that's mostly been burned.
Yeah.
So it's like that's where all the fat is. So if you're obese, the fat acts as like a wick plus the alcohol. And I just think that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So for that tangent.
Yeah, very.
Okay.
It seems very counterintuitive that like your hands and feet won't be as burned. Like I understand that fat fuel is a source or like is a source of fuel, but like the bones in your hands and feet are so much smaller that you would think it would take less heat just as a whole to burn it.
And I don't know if it's in the sense that when your body begins to burn, the heat and the fire just kind of targets midline, so there's not as much heat near the distal ends. Like I'm sure if you were curled up in a ball, things would kind of be dispersed pretty evenly. But
well, even when a body is burnt, this is another core memory from school that's haunted me since I've seen it. You go into pugilistic posture.
Yeah.
And so like your hands are all curled in and you're all like up, and that's I forget where I was going with that.
It just looks really eerie.
It's so scary. Your hands and feet are, I guess, away from the center of your body, and there's nothing there to really keep the fire going.
Yeah. So fat, proximity, some factors that play a part in it. And there's also some patterns that can show up on bones. And these are actually kind of predictable, and science and research has like proven these predictable changes. And this is color changes, shrinkage, fracture patterns, and then a histological or cellular change. I'm not really going to go into the histological component because the terms you can't really...
It's very visual.
It's very visual, 100% very visual. And even like me trying to discuss the terms like osteons and all of those things, like you don't know what I'm saying unless you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, kind of coming back to the color that you were talking about earlier, Journey, is your bone actually starts off as like a yellowy brown color, not the white that we are often familiar with. But as temperatures rise and heat is applied over time, bone will change to a darker yellow-brown and then ultimately to a black. And this is because oils will burn away from the bone and organic matter carbonizes. And so as components continue to burn from the bone goes like dark to light gray and then to a white. So you kind of go from like a light yellow to a brown to a dark brown to a black to a light gray, then to a white.
Right.
If that makes sense. I'll provide visuals. Visuals are always helpful. It was previously believed, though, that the color changes were caused by the temperatures themselves of the fire. So they thought a fire had to hit a certain degree to cause a certain color change. But they realized this actually wasn't the case, and it was actually just indicative of the state of decomposition during the heating process and the type of, and like the amount of organic matter that was lost during the process. Which I thought was pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Shrinkage is something that's seen. I've kind of touched on it too, but makes sense. As components evaporate from the bone, the entire structure will decrease in size. And so the greatest decrease is actually seen in areas that are composed of cortical bone, and this is the dense, solid bone that surrounds the marrow space. And so this is...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it surprises me that that's where we see the most decrease in size, because that's like the hard bone. Like, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And so I guess like when it comes to that, you have more exposure for longer with the hard bone because the trabecular bone is like under it. So you get that dense, you see it quicker and more in that denseness. And I guess with the trabecular bone, this is me just theorizing and using my brain, could be very wrong. But because the trabecular bone is more spongy, it probably has more give to shrinkage because of the mesh-like, sponge-like structure. Whereas cortical bone, because it's so dense, like any form of evaporation is going to just affect it in its entirety.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's just me speculating. Someone can correct me on that. I'm going to lock that answer in, though. With the cortical bones, these are seen in like the shafts of long bones. These areas face a greater possibility of shattering into smaller pieces when they undergo shrinkage because they don't have as much give. Whereas the trabecular bone, this is present at the end of your long bones, not as affected as much, and it generally retains its shape, so you wouldn't see as much shrinkage. I'll throw some terms at you though, but you wouldn't see as much shrinkage at the epiphyses of long bones compared to the diaphysis, which is like the shaft of the bone, essentially.
Yeah.
That was a tongue twister. Holy smoke.
Yeah, no doubt. Oh my gosh.
Sometimes I ponder, this is a side tangent, I ponder if I've got a speech impediment because of things like that. Like a lot of shushes and shuns. I'm like, why is this so difficult?
Just get tongue-tied.
I find that happens a lot when like my brain is moving faster than my mouth. So it's like they're just they're not lining up. Words are hard.
It happens like 80% of the time too. My brain is just go, go, go. And then my mouth just cannot follow as fast. Back to burnt bones, a little side tangent. While shrinkage is seen during the entire burning process, it's when temperatures exceed 800 degrees that the most shrinkage is seen. And this can decrease bones up to 10 to 15% in size, which is a fair amount of shrinkage.
Yeah, that's quite a bit.
And this could make sense where if you see this amount of shrinkage, it's not surprising that estimations regarding age, sex, and stature can greatly be influenced.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting with the temperature ranges. People like Anthony Kirkland, if they are trying to burn victims, whether it be to get rid of evidence or to like disfigure and impair identification, you need a really hot fire to do that. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't just be setting up a bonfire and hoping for the best. Like, some of these temperatures are like crematorium temperatures. And even then...
Yeah, you know? And it literally sounds like he just like pours lighter fluid on them and then throws a match on them and then just lets it happen. Like, it's not even like he's just more concerned about destroying like the immediate physical evidence versus like getting rid of who they are.
Yeah. They're like, oh, I guess I'll do this. Hopefully it does something. And then... Yeah,
because he's kind of like, they won't be able to prove that it's me because they can't find my DNA on there because their body's burnt. But it's like, dude, she's on your front steps. Yeah. So, like, you gotta think a little bit DNA.
Further than that, bro. Come on.
Yeah, literally.
Oh, boy. And yeah, so of course, not all bone undergoes the same amount of shrinkage. Another word that doesn't exist in my brain right now, because it's also dependent on other factors. And so these factors are the distribution of bone type, the temperature of exposure, the mineral content of bone, as well as the bone tissue. An interesting sex difference that's been recorded in research, and I got a little giggle out of this, and I got a giggle out of the class and Michelle as well when I gave my presentation. But male bones tend to shrink a little bit more. So shrinkage is more often seen in men, on average, than female bones, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That's fun.
Right?
Do you know why?
They have apparently a higher percentage of bone minerals compared to women. I don't really know much more than that.
It's kind of rude. Just taking all the minerals.
I know.
Yeah, they get more minerals. Why do we get more body fat? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I would like to speak to the manager.
But because of this shrinkage, remains have incorrectly been identified as female due to size when this wasn't taken into account. So there have been times where male bones have been burnt and then they weren't identified as male. Fracturing and cracking can also be seen, and the flat bone of the cranial vault, as well as the ilium, which is like your pelvic bone, can exhibit cracking. So I find it really interesting that certain bones kind of undergo specific patterns, if that makes sense. Like certain bones endure different things because of their structure. Another really interesting thing that can appear with burned bones with the cranial vault is that as temperatures increase, the cranial vault appears to explode in some instances.
Holy cow.
It's not actually exploding, which they've come to learn. Researchers originally thought that this was due to built up pressure. So basically like just the steaming of your insides of your cranial vault.
Well, that's my first thought too.
Yeah, would increase the pressure. And they believed that the soft tissues would block the magnum foramen, which is like the large hole at the base of your skull pretty much. And then that would prevent the pressure from escaping. So they thought that happened, skull exploded. In reality, though, it is a combination of external events plus the brittle mechanical properties of the altered bone. And it just causes it to crack in a way that looks like it exploded. So not as fun, not as
Do you have a visual you'll put on the website of that? Because I really want to see it.
I think so. Let me see.
Sick.
Yeah,
you don't have to find it right now, but I'll check later.
I will also share my slideshow with you guys. I have like all of the visuals with that. I probably should have sent that to you guys beforehand, but yeah, I got slides to go along with like all of this.
Sick.
So yeah, this exploding skull phenomenon can be seen, and in addition to this though, one of the most common fracture types seen in skulls is what's called delamination. And this is when the cortical bone, which is that dense solid bone, will shrink, and then it separates from that trabecular bone underneath, and it will actually curl and like peel up, causing small little cracks. Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in a lot of cases, the way that this pattern exhibits itself on the bone actually closely resembles injuries seen with like projectiles or blunt force trauma. So there can be a lot of confusion when examining remains in determining whether blunt force trauma happened, projectile happened, or, I mean, I would like to think that they would notice that a bone had been burnt, but if it was just like the one bone and they had to figure it out, there could be some confusion.
I guess like they wouldn't be able to tell, like, is this an issue from the body being burnt, or was this there beforehand?
Yeah. Another really cool thing that bones can exhibit is venting patterns. And this can happen to ante or perimortem fractures as well as sutures. So like your cranial sutures. And this is when fracture lines are outlined in black almost. So kind of like a charcoal, they're kind of charred. And this is from the the pressurized venting inside your body when water and organic matter evaporates.
That's cool.
Yeah. So
it's kind of like, sorry, this is going to sound gross, but it's like your insides are turning to soup.
Yeah, a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then they're trying to escape the little pot lid. And then that in between is where you see the charcoalness.
That's a great analogy. Super gross.
Super gross. Hopefully it helps you envision it.
It does.
Knowing, though, which way bones react to thermal damage, I know I did just spit a lot of information at you, but it is good to know the differences in how bones can react to thermal damage because it can provide a lot of insight into cases involving these burnt remains. So information about the source and the temperature of the fire can sometimes be determined. The damage can help in estimating the decomp stage of the body before being burned. And since not all bone is completely burned and turned to ash, which we had talked about, remaining fragments can be helpful in giving some context to the case. It's difficult because minimal fragments provide a lot more work to try and figure out, but it is that little bit of information that you may not have had with like a full crematorium cremation remains. And talking about like different bones having different patterns, I guess, or exhibiting different patterns, they react differently with heat. So over half the time, your maxilla and mandibular fragments, so these are like your jaw bones, they remain most of the time. They don't actually get burnt. And then portions of the temporal bone, your finger bones, your phalanges, your femur, and your humerus also remain. Which, like, seems weird because you've got big bones in there with your little bones.
Yeah. Well, like, I guess the phalanges, like, they're furthest away. So I guess that kind of makes sense. Mm-hmm. But your femur and your humerus, like, those are pretty big bones. Right? And, like, if your hip bones burn, like, what? Yeah. That's odd.
Yeah. Same thing with, like, I'm surprised that you find jawbone fragments of, like, anything else. Which is also unfortunate for people that try to hide evidence through burning because of, like... I don't know if the teeth would still be intact, but like usually your teeth are attached to your jawbone. So you have a better chance of identifying them. So
exactly
interesting.
And even the temporal bone, like what a random bone to just have left over.
Yeah.
It's right? Super weird.
And then like in addition to those as well, you have your external occipital protuberance, which is the back of your skull, your acetabulum, which is your hip socket, and then the pubic symphysis. They are also found over half the time, apparently.
How I thought your pubic symphysis was like cartilage. Am I wrong in that?
It is, but they're the bones that meet on each side.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But still, that is so weird.
Right? Yeah. And then, yeah, it's really interesting because the bones, I guess, with the greater density and those well embedded into muscle are the ones that are frequently found, as well as the more distal bones that we've kind of talked about.
Right.
Now, kind of on the other side of that, the bones that are less likely to survive high temperatures are your zygomatics, which are like your cheekbones, your frontal bone, your sacral vertebrae. I don't know why the sacral and not your other like vertebrae.
Because the
your sacral's your tailbone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess like because like parts of your pelvis get found, like your hip joints, your sacrum, or
But these
symphysis,
are the ones
all that
don't survive high temperatures. Like this is like the other end of it.
Okay, never mind. Yeah, never mind. That's weird.
Yeah, your sacrum's attached to your like hip bones, right? So if your entire hip bone is gone, your sacrum's going to be gone too.
But aspects of your hip bone don't go. Like your acetabulum?
Not all of them, but like the upper parts do.
Oh, the majority of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I feel like it's by your butt, and a lot of women carry fat on their butts. So I feel like
that's very true.
That makes sense.
That could also play.
Yeah, you don't have a lot of fat distribution along like your back and your neck compared to
Yeah, it's like
your
low
junk in the
back and
trunk.
butt area. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, once I actually think about fat distribution.
That's my theory.
Thinking of things. Yeah, using our brains. But then you also have your clavicles, which makes sense. They're just kind of there. And then
Surprisingly by your boobs too, right?
Yeah. And your carpals, which I was a little shocked by because if your phalanges are sticking around, your carpals are not though, which are like your wrist bones essentially. Like
That's
and
so
there's
fishy.
like no fat in
No.
like generally, like there is so little fat in there. It's just bone and joints and stuff. Like,
and you would think if those go, your fingers would go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
They're right
But
there.
unless, I guess, if your fingers are in a fist and your arms are up like this, then I guess you're like your wrists are
go
closer
into
to the
pugilistic?
rest of your body.
Do you always go into pugilistic posture? Probably because you're like muscle. Yeah.
I think it would depend on the level of decomp because your muscles need to be able to contract. Like they still need to have like a little bit of life in them to contract.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Life is the wrong word for that, but I hope you guys know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I get what you're putting down. But yeah, that's kind of the end of my whole spiel. Like many aspects in forensics, though, the pattern seen in bone caused by thermal damage aren't always going to be the same. So it's not like you can rely on the same set of patterns for every set of remains that you find. And that being said, a lot of existing studies do vary in their findings on how body state affects burnt bones. So this was like the fleshed, defleshed, that whole kind of thing. And this is, again, we've talked about this in the past with our forensics, like faults in forensics is there's no great standardization method. Yeah. And like burning is so unpredictable and so uncontrollable that you can't have a controlled environment to test. You know, like you just can't really.
Yeah.
And fire is just so dependent on many, many factors, and this ultimately influences its effect on bones. But given the general pattern seen, experts are able to kind of build their case bit by bit off of that. It's not an exact science, but it is one that they can just kind of loosely go off of.
Yeah. They have enough information that they're not like completely guessing, but
yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
But yeah, you're welcome for listening to me talk for an hour.
Well, I very much enjoyed it. I know you said you're getting a little sick of your voice, but I very much enjoyed listening to this topic.
It was so cool. I'm so bummed I missed your actual like presentation in school.
I am not very proud of many of my presentations just because I like dissociate and I have forgotten many, many parts of that. But this was one that I really enjoyed. I love talking about burnt bones. It sounds
so
strange,
interesting.
But I was like, I really wanted to just burn one as get a little chicken bone, do a little science experiment. Maybe
I was just gonna say, like, you can get some pretty big pieces of pig from a butcher shop. Mm-hmm. Just go and be like, hey, what scraps do you have?
I need to create a science experiment.
I'm sure my neighbors in my apartment would love that.
Yeah, maybe you want like a private property to conduct your experiments on, or
Michelle Farm.
Yeah, when you come up to my farm, we can do some experimenting.
Okay. Well, that was a weird noise I just made.
Allegedly, we'll do some experimenting
yeah.
for legal reasons or whatever.
Do you still have your manure pile?
Mm-hmm.
Can we pilfer through that?
You're not going to want to, and there's not going to be a lot left over, but I'm sure we can.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll send
we
your mom
can
a
also
message.
add into an experiment too.
Okay. Cool. Love that. For those
Amazing.
that don't know, Journey has a sheep farm. That's
My
what
family
we're
has a
talking
sheep farm, yeah.
Yeah, their family has a sheep
access
farm.
to remains.
There are access to sheep that have passed.
Yes.
Anyways.
sheep remains. Yeah,
Yes.
Non-human. That should be clarified.
For legal reasons. I do not have access to human remains.
All right. Well, now that we've discovered that none of us have legal access to them, so don't go spreading those rumors.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for telling us both our case study of Anthony Kirkland and all about burnt bones and how that related to his case today. I learned a lot. I do the same thing as Nicole. I kind of just dissociate doing presentations, or if it's within the same class. So I'm pretty sure, Nicole, I was there for your presentation, but I don't really remember it. But yeah, that was really fascinating, and I loved hearing about it. So thank you. And just on, I guess not so much of a lighter note, I have no idea what this case update is. But just to kind of turn the tables a little bit, talk about a little bit something new. Journey, I know you have a fun fact or update, or I don't know what to call these things because we always do different stuff.
I know, we need to find like a fun little name or like a forensics corner or something.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah,
right?
But your fun fact or your fun update or your fun new
Can we
discovery
capitalize on like forensic files?
I suppose. Wait.
We go like
what?
for our fun fact, we're like, oh, it's our forensic file.
Would that be copywritten though?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Oh,
I don't know.
Okay. Maybe.
I don't know.
We'll
We'll
look
think about
into
it. If any of our listeners have any suggestions, please send them in.
Yeah.
Okay, so my update is that Gypsy Rose Blanchard has been released from prison. I don't know if you guys know who that is or if you've already heard about this.
I've seen it in passing. Yeah.
I like the Basement Yard podcast like talked about it, and I couldn't remember her name. And so they were like, oh my gosh, like Gypsy Rose is free. And I just thought they were talking about like just a random person off the street. But yeah, so she was sentenced to 10 years in prison for getting her boyfriend to kill her mom in 2015. And she was released 3 years early for good behavior. And so her mom, Dee Dee, had suffered from Munchausen's by proxy and convinced everyone that her daughter suffered from like everything under the sun. Like they had her in a wheelchair taking so much medication, like so much stuff, even though Gypsy Rose was like perfectly healthy. And so there's like a documentary about her story called Mommy, Dead, and Dearest. And there's a movie that's based on her story called Run. It is scary, but very, very well done. So yeah, that's just my update, is that she is out of prison.
Do you want to know an even funnier addition to that update? Apparently, she is a guest judge on RuPaul's Drag Race.
Really? I haven't heard that, which is crazy.
Yeah.
I have so much to say. Like, I feel like we could do a whole other discussion on this. Like, I have so much to say about, like, not that her being released is a bad thing. Like, I know she was a victim in this. Like, she believed she had all of these diseases and disorders. But I just think we need, like, I just think she needs to go live a private life and change her name and just stop being in the spotlight. You know, like
she posted on Instagram. She's like, first selfie in freedom, and it got like 7.4 million likes.
Wow.
Like, yeah.
That's a lot of eyes on you.
Yeah.
Especially after something that happens.
It really is. Like, I understand she's a victim and we need to support victims, but it just feels like it's going really far because she did still hire her boyfriend to kill her own mother.
So and she was pretty young by the sounds of it too.
Yeah, wasn't she? She was under 18, wasn't she?
Yeah, I think so.
How many years did her? We should just do a whole other episode on her.
Yeah, I did add her to our topic list. I'm pretty sure, that we can. Yeah,
because I would love to talk about her case. Like that is Munchausen by proxy is just really fascinating because it's such like a scary and sad mental illness that directly affects not only the just the victim, but also like the victim has a victim. Like it's
exactly.
Yeah.
So that was just my fun little update.
Well, thank you so much. I am always open to talk about the current happenings of Gypsy Rose's case. They are, it's just really fascinating. I've never seen someone who we know for certain has like conducted a crime like this get so much positive attention and fame. That's just kind of crazy to me. But
she was only sentenced to 10 years.
And I remember her like seeing her social media presence before all of this happened.
Me too.
Really? And then she's like gone. And then it was like, oh, she's in jail now. And then you're like, what happened? Oh my gosh. And I was like, oh, her mom was killed. And then now 10 years of, Yeah.
Oh my gosh. No, I didn't have social media then. I don't think so. I had no, like I wasn't following her at all. That's crazy.
I didn't like follow her, but I had seen her like in passing on articles and stuff like that.
Wild.
Super wild.
That is so crazy.
Wow. The passing of time. That is crazy and terrifying.
I feel like it has not been 7 years since all of that went down, but here we are. 7 years later, we all have graduated and we're not like, I think that happened when we were in like middle school and high school, and now we're all like multiple years out of university. That's whack.
Yeah. 2015, I was in grade 11.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That's insane.
But anyways, thank you both so much for sharing those topics with us, with our listeners, with me. I really enjoyed listening and discussing all of this today. And with that said, I know we had briefly mentioned earlier in the episode, but our next episode is going to be with Dr. Meredith Teese. She is a PhD in forensic anthropology, and she is going to be telling us all about her involvement in the Dozier School for Boys excavation project. I won't get too much into it because I don't want to like spoil anything, because it was a really fun episode to record and you should listen to it. So with that being said, if you guys have enjoyed what we did today and want to check us out some more, be sure to head over to our Instagram, YouTube, or Facebook. They are all at What the Forensics. Or head to our website. It's your one-stop shop for everything What the Forensics. That's just whattheforensics.ca. You'll find the images that Nicole was talking about, all of our sources for the episode. We also post media recommendations. So like the documentary and movie that Journey just mentioned about Gypsy Rose, those will be on there. And yeah, it's just everything you could need from What the Forensics. And so with that being said, the final thing is, if you guys enjoyed and you are feeling generous and want to leave a review, we really love to read them, and they also really help us out. So they'd be greatly appreciated. This has been another episode of What the Forensics. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Bye! Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just interested in forensics and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week.